Mike is the perfect candidate to introduce Steve. Both Mike, who is the founding financial editor and economic commentator for CNN for 25 years, and Steve have a few things in common. Most important, both have won at least 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards, and they're both young enough to get a couple more. Michael?
Thanks, Bernie. I'm really pleased to introduce my old friend Steve Shepard and tell you why he's so eminently qualified to receive the Silurians Lifetime Achievement Award. Many of you have already read Lynn's wonderful article about life with Steve in the Silurian News, so I needn't go into great detail about his illustrious career. But briefly, he grew up in the Bronx, studied engineering at City College in Columbia, but quickly morphed into journalism at McGraw-Hill. He later switched from BusinessWeek to Newsweek. A very good move for him, because not only did he become a top editor there, but because it was also there that he met Lynn Povich, now his wife of 38 years, and a notable journalist herself. Then Steve went back to BusinessWeek, where he was editor-in-chief for 20 years in the magazine's glory days before he retired in 2005. During that period, he also served 2 years as president of the American Society of Magazine Editors. And oh yes, he was also the founding director of what's now the Knight Bagehot Fellowship in Business and Economic Journalism at Columbia J School. All the way, he's been a strong defender of freedom of the press. That's a pretty outstanding career, right? But far from over. When the City University of New York wanted to start a graduate school of journalism, the chancellor turned to Steve to create it. And so he built it from scratch with the help of a talented faculty and administration. They built it into a remarkable institution, the only public graduate J school in the entire northeast of the U.S. He retired from there after 8 years and wrote a book titled Deadlines and Disruption: My Turbulent Path from Print to Digital. And he's still going. He just finished another book to be published shortly based on a long-time interest of his. It's titled A Literary Journey to Jewish Identity, Rereading Bellow, Roth, Malamud, Ozick, and other great Jewish writers. So for all those reasons and more, Steve Shepard is the recipient of our Lifetime Achievement Award. Steve. Okay, that's enough. You give him a swelled head, you don't know what he'll do next. On behalf of President Bernie Kirsch and myself, and all the Silurians, I should like to read the inscription on this beautiful plaque. It reads, "The Society of the Silurians Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Stephen B. Shepard in recognition of a distinguished career in journalism as a magazine writer and editor, as a mentor of young business journalists, as the founding dean of the City University of New York's Graduate School of Journalism, and as an outspoken advocate of press freedom, the National Arts Club, November 15th, 2017.
Thank you very, very much, dear friend Mike Kandel and Bernie Kirsch. and thank you all very, very much for this terrific award. I'm especially thrilled to be honored by a group that includes so many journalists I have long admired. And I'm delighted that some of my former colleagues from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism are here tonight. Judy Watson, who is my partner in crime in starting the school, Andy Mendelson, Jane Sassine, Jerry Hester. Thank you all for being here. Yeah. Don't ask me to say it again. Yeah. Well, then I have to hold it. This is all right. I also want to express my gratitude, as Mike indicated, to my wife, Lynn Povich, who is a pretty damn good journalist in her own right. Thank you. I want to speak tonight about a problem that worries me about our profession, as I'm sure it worries you, and that is the low level of public trust in the news media. Now, it would be very, very easy to blame Donald Trump for our problems. He continues to label any story he doesn't like as fake news, and he has called the news media the enemy of the American people. At a rally in Phoenix over the summer, he went so far as to call journalists sick people who don't like our country. His attacks are outrageous, of course, and they threaten to weaken our democracy and the news media's role in it. But our dear president is merely fanning flames that have been raging for years. According to Gallup, trust in the news media has declined steadily since it peaked at 72% way back in 1976, just after Watergate. Trust in the media has been below 50% for the last decade. And just before the election last year, it hit 32%, an all-time low, according to Gallup. Let me just say that again. Only 32% of people trusted us to do a fair and accurate job of reporting the news. Like many of you, I have struggled to understand why the profession we revere so much is so mistrusted by so many people. As far as I can tell, there are two major reasons for the distrust. One is the perception that we are biased politically, a view held most avidly by conservatives, who have been told for years by talk radio and Fox News that we're just a bunch of pointy-headed liberals. The Gallup numbers support the notion that Republicans especially distrust us. Their public trust number is just 14%. But bias is hard to prove. The New York Times is often thought of as a liberal newspaper, particularly by conservatives. How then do they explain the Times' aggressive coverage of the Whitewater issue when Bill Clinton was president? Or breaking the story of Eliot Spitzer's visit to a prostitute that forced him from the governor's mansion in Albany? If the Times does have a liberal agenda, why was it so slow to get aggressive about Trump's campaign during the GOP's primaries? And why did it provide such nonstop and damaging coverage of Hillary Clinton's email server? Judging by her recent book, I can't imagine that Hillary thinks that the Times is a liberal newspaper. Most of the academic studies that have been done tend to show that bias is often in the eyes of the beholder, whether you're Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or John Doe. If you're a conservative, the studies show, the coverage looks decidedly left-wing. If you're a liberal, you tend to see conservative bias. And the deeper your conviction, right or left, the deeper your perception that things are biased against you. There's even a name for this. It's called the hostile media effect. The more you care, the more you'll perceive the media as hostile to your point of view. Well, maybe that's just human nature. We all want affirmation of our own views. We all want to hear what we believe, especially in an election year. In short, while the perception of political bias is certainly out there, especially among conservatives, the reality of it is not at all convincing to me. The evidence we have from content analysis and academic studies suggests that the charge of political bias is largely a bum rap. But there is a second reason for the distrust of the media, a reason that makes more sense to me. And that is this. Many people believe that the mainstream media is elitist. By mainstream media, they seem to mean the big city newspapers, the TV networks, the leading magazines, and perhaps even the journalism schools. And by elitist, they seem to mean we ignore the concerns of everyday folk, that we tend to look down on the average Joe or Jane, that we are just coastal snobs who regard the rest of America as flyover country. And that our coverage reflects this bias. We cover lacrosse, surely an elite sport, while largely ignoring stock car racing, which attracts millions of fans. We regularly cover the Ivy League and other elite colleges, but rarely examine community colleges, which enroll nearly half of the undergraduate students in the United States. We write about income inequality as an economic problem, but hardly ever look at its victims or their communities in working-class America. We cover advanced medical research at our finest big city hospitals, but we did not understand the causes of the emerging opioid epidemic on the streets of Albuquerque, Louisville, or the rest of Middle America. Is it any wonder that we in the mainstream media missed the story of the angst in America? Is it any wonder that we were thus stunned when Trump won the election? Hillary Clinton didn't go to Michigan or Wisconsin, but neither did mainstream media. We just didn't know what was happening on the ground in many battleground states. In short, we blew it, not just because our polling was wrong, but because our reporting was negligent. In the past, we might have relied on our strongest regional newspapers, like the Des Moines Register, the Detroit Free Press, or the Milwaukee Journal, to provide substantial reporting in the Midwest. But those papers have suffered draconian cutbacks in circulation and staffing. By some estimates, local newspapers have shed nearly half their reporters over the last decade or so. Half their reporters, which of course was followed by the inevitable decline in coverage. It's true that regional news outlets did report local layoffs and factory closings, but they generally failed to connect the dots. They failed to draw the big picture of the angst and anger in their own backyard and what it meant for our politics and for our country. Some of this anger was ripening right here in New York City, where we have a kind of middle America in our own midst. It's called Staten Island. We have long known that Staten Island is more Republican than the other boroughs, but it nonetheless voted for Barack Obama in 2012, along with the rest of the city. Yet in 2016, unlike the rest of the city, Staten Island switched overwhelmingly to Donald Trump. He crushed Hillary Clinton there 57-40. Why? Well, it might have been worth a ferry ride before the election to find out what was going on among our non-elitist neighbors. Maybe it would have provided some clues about the national mood among disaffected people. But mainstream media in New York generally didn't bother with Staten Island. In the past, too, we might have read prescient stories about Middle America in our three national news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News. But two of them are essentially gone, and the other one is a shadow of its former self. Clearly, the business problems plaguing the news media have hurt our ability to understand what is going on in our country. It's true that we have fresh coverage from new outlets such as Politico, ProPublica, BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, and the Texas Tribune. But as good as they are, they're not yet widespread enough to offset the closed bureaus and cutbacks in mainstream media. Our profession must find a better way to cover middle America, blue-collar America, working-class America, whatever you want to call it. None of this will be easy at a tough time for journalism. Fortunately, there are some encouraging signs that some media outlets are broadening their horizon, widening their gaze. The new editor of the Huffington Post, Lydia Polgreen, who came from the New York Times, recently went on a 25-city tour called Listen to America. Her goal, she said, was to reposition the site to reach, quote, an audience that feels left out. So many news organizations already go after elite audiences, she said. End quote, point taken. We'll soon see what changes HuffPost actually makes. ProPublica, the investigative reporting site that has won several Pulitzer Prizes since it was established in 2007, is expanding to the Midwest. It is opening ProPublica Illinois, which will focus on local stories. Ultimately, it wants to expand to other parts of the country, the better to help offset the serious decline in local reporting. There's more. The Lenfest Institute, a nonprofit in Philadelphia, is investing heavily to shore up journalism in Pennsylvania, starting with the 3 outlets it already owns: the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and Philly.com. One of the most intriguing startups in the U.S. is called Report for America, which is modeled to some extent on Teach for America. The idea is to work with traditional news organizations to supplement their coverage. Over the next 5 years, Report for America wants to place 1,000 reporters in local newsrooms around the country. 1,000 reporters, that's really a lot more boots on the ground. And what about the big newspapers with national ambitions? The Washington Post, flush with money from Jeff Bezos, is expanding across the board. More reporters, more pages, more investigative journalism. And that has meant more on-the-ground stories from America's heartland. And the New York Times has reopened bureaus around the country that it had closed, including one in Kansas City, the very heart of the heartland. The Times now has more national reporters than ever. That is, reporters based somewhere other than New York or Washington. The results are starting to show at the Times. To cite just one recent example, it ran a strong piece reporting that Iowa, once a swing state, is becoming increasingly Republican. Why? Because college graduates, disproportionately Democratic, are fleeing a state that simply does not have enough professional and white-collar jobs to keep them. Not good news if you're a Democrat, but important to know. In a funny way, Donald Trump may actually be helping us. So many people are alarmed by his presidency that many major news outlets are experiencing an increase in paid circulation and in web traffic. In the case of ProPublica, which is a nonprofit, donations are way up. At both the Times and the Washington Post, subscriptions are booming, especially for the digital editions, which suggests a more national audience for both of them. They're calling it the Trump bump. The Trump bump is even showing up in public opinion. Last November, around the time of the election, Reuters polled Americans about their views of the news media. The result was pretty much in line with what Gallup had found. Only 39% of Americans in the Reuters poll said they trusted the news media. A couple of months ago, well into the Trump presidency, trust in the news media had jumped to 48%, according to Reuters. 48% now, up from 39% a year ago. Still low, but a nice increase. I hope these things are encouraging signs of change, not just straws in the wind. But even so, much more needs to be done to improve our coverage and our reputation. Among other things, if we are to shed our elitism, we need to hire more reporters from diverse economic and geographic backgrounds. Why, for example, are there so few reporters who are military veterans? Surely we can find a few more. And what about the elite schools we tend to hire from? It's fine to recruit from Columbia and Berkeley. But what about the University of Nebraska, or Wayne State in Detroit, or yes, the College of Staten Island? Above all, we need to change whatever elite attitude exists in our newsroom. We need to understand that the election of Donald Trump was not just a fluke, or that it was caused just by the manifest shortcomings of Hillary Clinton. As much as anything, it reflected the disappointment of millions of ordinary people who have difficulty coping with the changes in America, especially globalization, rapid technological change, the decline of well-paying jobs, and the increase in immigration. Our reporting must provide the depth and perspective to understand what is happening to millions of our fellow citizens, many of them less fortunate than we are. If much of the problem is indeed elitism in mainstream media, as I believe it is, surely it's long past time that we got over it. Thank you all very, very much for listening.
I wanted to thank you for your comments. It struck such a chord. A couple of years ago, I'm originally from a very small and economically depressed town in the Midwest, where many of our young men and women, about half of my high school graduating class, went into the military. Many bodies coming home in body bags, unfortunately, from Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would be that person at meetings saying, my Facebook feed from my high school friends is saying, we're missing this story. And to your point, I would be shushed and I would be told, I would see on my Facebook feed people feeling like they weren't connecting with the candidates. They were worried about a war in Afghanistan. They were worried about the factories closing. They were worried about a rising cost of living that we weren't covering. And I would try to politely push and say, hey, I'm seeing this and I don't think it's an aberration. And my husband, who's from Michigan and from a small town, was seeing similar things. So we're from Wisconsin and Michigan, two of the states that were deciding factors in the election. But to your point, I was, while respected, I was rather dismissed as that's an aberration. And I was at one point told by a boss that this was irrational, what I was saying. And to your point, even if we're putting reporters out there, which is great, right? The growing geographic diversity and the Times is putting people out there. What do you think about, are we at a point where there's enough in the leadership positions that are starting to open their minds to the presence of the military and the military story, which often gets way sidelined because I don't know of any editors or managers that were ever in the military, right? I mean, there's so much has changed. I guess I'm concerned as somebody who both loves being a journalist, but is also from this middle ground. Is there hope? Because everything is so top heavy and people don't have the military backgrounds and most people in those top levels have gone to the Ivy Leagues or are kind of in those circles or only based now on the east and the left coast. My name is Mary Flum. I'm currently with NBC. I was within another organization when I had those talks. So just FYI.
I think because there's a really strong recognition in the news media that we didn't get it right, that the news media in general, along with a lot of America, was surprised when Donald Trump won the election. And they recognized that they didn't do a good enough job at finding out what was going on. And because it came down to those three states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, there was a lot of sense that we didn't know what the hell was going on. So I think there's a lot of change, as I tried to indicate at the Post and the Times, which are national newspapers, to be more on the ground locally and try to understand what the hell is happening and why Donald Trump was elected president. As for the military, this is a tough problem. We at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism were trying very, very hard to recruit people as graduate students. These are people 28, 30 years old, so they could have served time in the military. And we advertised in Stars and Stripes, and we tried to recruit students. I think Andy may have a better number than I did, but in the 7 or 8 years that I was there, I don't think we had more than 3 or 4 people who had served in the military coming to Graduate School of Journalism. And I think Columbia's had the same experiences we had. So it's a hard problem to solve. And, you know, maybe they don't want to be journalists, but having seen war and having served in the military, you'd think they'd be interested. So I don't know what we can do to get better representation of military veterans in the news media, but it is a problem.
Steve, to
Yeah.
extend Mary's question, would
Yeah.
you apply this question to social media? Is it worse or is it better?
What do you mean? Is it worse?
The idea of missing
Oh.
a big chunk of America.
Well, I think, the idea that somebody posted something on Facebook, which was close to the truth, the issue there is how much circulation does it get? Facebook reaches 8 zillion people, but how many people are reading things like that? I don't know. It has the potential to help solve the problem because it's voices from everywhere, and that can be helpful. But they are in the content distribution business, social media. They are not in the content creation business. So even if their news feed is carrying stories from lots of different newspapers and magazines, they are not themselves in the business of creating content unless you read everybody's post from everywhere, which is obviously impossible. So I don't know how that's going to play out. It has the potential to because it's all over. Warren.
Hi, Steve. I want to ask you questions about your being an educator of journalists. How has, in your time, the education of journalists changed? You've described eloquently the problem for the profession. So does it inform instruction? And the second thing I want to ask you, is it possible to characterize who comes to journalism now? I think all of us in this room came to journalism with somewhat the same kind of ambition. We were going to hold people accountable. We were going to learn to write well, to communicate well. Are the ambitions of young journalists now, or young journalists to be who come to CUNY, different than they were in our time?
Well, the education of journalists at a graduate school has changed dramatically. I mean, even after I went there, it changed. We opened up in August 2006. Twitter started about the same time, Facebook a little bit later. And it wasn't for a year or two until we began to see their impact. So what's happened to journalism education is that everybody has had to adjust to this technological disruption of ordinary journalism that we grew up with. And so everybody has to teach a lot more about the technology of journalism and the distribution of journalism and the two-way streetness of journalism that never existed in our day. So that's been a massive, massive change. Our program is 1.5 years, and a bunch of students stay 2 years for a master's degree because it's very hard to get this done in a year. When we started the school, we understood we couldn't get it done in a year because we saw things starting to change. So it's a longer program. It has a new technological dimension that never existed in the old days. Does this change the nature of the students who are coming? I don't know. I think a lot of them still have the same views that we had of wanting to be journalists. We wanted to hold power accountable. We wanted to go get great stories. We wanted to disclose things. And there was a kind of idealism to it. We felt we were acting in the public interest, and we could feel good about ourselves, and it compensated to some degree for the low salaries and all of that. I think now students coming into journalism understand that they have to learn something more. They have to be multimedia journalists. You just can't write a story anymore. And you have to be able to use social media to report your story, to disseminate your story, to get feedback on your story. So all of that has changed. Now, whether that's influenced why people are becoming journalists because they like the technology, I don't really know. I mean, is Andy there? Does you have any idea whether they're coming for other reasons than they did some years ago? Not really. He's shaking his head no. And CUNY is about, as an institution, is, probably the least elitist university in the country. And the journalism school attracts people from all over. And we look for people who have a passion for journalism. We give everybody a paid summer internship precisely because we don't want to keep away people who don't have money. We give out a hell of a lot of scholarships, even though the tuition is very, very low. And that's important to do because the people who would come to a university like CUNY are precisely the people that I'm talking about. Yeah, do we have people who went to Ivy League colleges? Of course we do. But we have a lot of people from all over the country who went to public universities as undergraduates. And so we're trying, to diversify the profession that way. We all talk about diversity as a matter of race. And, it is important. And we have a high percentage of students of color from all over, at least in the 40%. But I'm talking about a different kind of diversity. I'm talking about an economic diversity. I'm talking about a geographic diversity. And that's what we need to do. We're not giving up on the racial diversity, but we need to do this in addition. We need more working class people. We need more people from other parts of the country. We need more military veterans. And that's what will change things. And I think to some degree it's going on at those schools as well.
What about gender diversity?
We need more men. It's true. 2/3 of the students at CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, 2/3 of the students at Columbia, and it's probably true at Missouri and Berkeley and USC and Northwestern as well. 2/3 of them are women. Some cases over 70%. And this is great. I don't pay as much attention to it about the recruitment when I was there because we were getting plenty of women. The issue I wanted to be sure of was, were they being treated properly once they came to CUNY? Were they respected? Did they get their share of the good stories? Were they able to speak up in meetings and so on? And I guess having 2 out of 3 being women helped in that score. So, Jerry, go ahead. All right. Through here, and then we'll come to you.
Steve, I'm concerned about the inclination of news organizations like the Times, who are engaged increasingly in self-promotion. This has come upon us incrementally over the years. When I was coming up in journalism, I was not required to be loyal to the New York Times. I was required to be loyal to journalism, and that would satisfactorily serve the Times' purpose and its readers. Now, there are many indications, you don't have to be a genius to perceive this, especially at the Times, because I don't read all the other publications, where reporters are under pressure to promote themselves and their stories on the web, on social media. Do all you can to boost circulation. Do all you can to promote yourself as a genius reporter who has done wonderful things. I spoke to a couple of my colleagues here tonight about this subject. Some were perceived it well, and others didn't quite get it. I did a story maybe a year ago about a guy who had been, I work on obituaries now, advance obits. This guy had been dead for 7 years. That's a good backstory. I was asked to do some kind of story about it that would require me to be self-promotional. I refused to do it. I suggested that my editor do it because he's the proper person to voice any praise for me, not me. I can't write a story pointing out how wonderfully I did this. Look, for the New York Times to do this, I think is a tragedy. It's not in that business. We're in the business of journalism. I don't want to say any more about it.
We're at a time in journalism, as in many other things, where what was once the brand of the institution, in this case the New York Times, is becoming brands of individuals. That bylines matter. People look for bylines. When I see a Bob McFadden byline on a story, encourages me to some degree to read it as opposed to some other byline. So it's always been that way to some degree. Whether it's worse now, I really can't say. I don't know. And it's true that we have business problems, and it's true that promoting a lot of individual brands of a lot of individual reporters might be a good way of attracting readers. I don't know that to be the case, but maybe that's the thinking. I don't know. Does anybody else have anything to say about that? Isn't
Yeah.
me, Jerry? It's well, it depends what they're asking you to do. If they're only asking you to talk about how you got the story, I don't see an ethical problem with that. You may have a personal problem. I would have the same problem. I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight and thought, Jesus, I'm supposed to talk about the life and times of Steve Shepard or something, say something profound about, and I wasn't going to do it. I don't like to do it any more than you do it. So I found a subject that I thought was important, and that's what I would talk about. But that's not an ethical problem or an ethical decision. That's an individual decision based on your personality and my personality. We'd rather not do that. We'd rather talk about issues or stories. So I don't see it as an ethical problem. I see it as maybe a business necessity. And God knows I'm for anything that is ethical that helps the business of journalism, because, as I tried to show, the decline in journalism has serious consequences. Jerry Eskenazi?
Hi, Jerry Eskenazi, Steve. First, I hope you have a copy of your talk so that you can make a pitch to the Times op-ed page with it. I have a question following up on some of the things that you had suggested. What if, for example, the newspapers had sent to those battleground states or had sent people to Staten Island? Would this have empowered them to feel differently, or would it have made the public more aware of what was really going on? In other words, the idea of not covering the middle America or the working stiff, how did that affect? Did that affect the election because the people there didn't feel empowered, or we didn't understand what was going on?
Well, clearly the latter. We didn't understand what was going on. That's why we didn't report it. We didn't even know that there was something going on. We knew there were factories closing and there was hardship in manufacturing and so forth. We didn't understand the depth of that problem that led to that anger, that frustration, and the election of Donald Trump. That's clearly what happened. So whether I think that they feel that they should have covered the story better. They should have known what was going on and the effect it would have on this election. And I think they would regret it. I don't know what they would say about it, but I think they would admit, I know they have admitted, that they didn't get the story fully. Okay? They got parts of the story, they didn't get it fully, and they missed this pretty completely. And they weren't the only ones. It was just about everybody. And that's why Hillary Clinton didn't go to Michigan and Wisconsin to campaign. She didn't know what was going on either.
We have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to take one of them.
Yeah, that's it.
You be quiet. This is a most unusual question. This question is not for our guest. It's for our guest's wife, Lynn Povich. Now, the reason I'm going
a very tough question.
The reason I'm going to ask this question, because some of us are too young to remember that Lynn's father, Shirley Povich, was one of the great sports writers of our time for the Washington Post. Now, as long as I've known Lynn, I've never asked her this question. How did he get along being a sports writer with the name Shirley?
Well, thank you, Mike. So he had a Yiddish name. He was from an Orthodox Jewish family in Bar Harbor, Maine. And they all had Yiddish names. And when they translated his Yiddish name into English, it was Shirley. And in New England, a lot of the men had British surnames. Claire, Evelyn, Shirley. I mean, this is a very common British tradition. And since it was in Maine, it wasn't unusual. He said he went to school with 5 boys named Shirley, and he has a cousin named Shirley Povich, who was a judge in Maine. So that's how he got to be Shirley. But I'll just tell you two quick stories. One is that he used to go on the road to cover the teams. You know, they go on these long train rides. And whenever he got to a hotel, he always roomed with his friend Bob Considine. And when Considine worked at the Post. And they would get to their hotel room, and there would be a bottle of scotch for Bob Considine and a bouquet of roses for Shirley Povich. And the other thing, and this just shows my father had a wonderful sort of wit, he got a letter one day from Who's Who in America saying they were starting a new edition called Who's Who of American Women. And they would like very much for Shirley Povich to be part of this edition. And they sent him a questionnaire. And he filled out the questionnaire. He said he was married to Ethel, he had 3 children, and so on and so forth, and he worked for the Washington Post and blah, blah, blah. And there was a question at the bottom that said, has your gender ever inhibited you in your profession? And he wrote, no, I just try to be one of the boys.
Well, one more question. We can't let Lynn steal the spotlight. Who's got the last? Be quiet, Tony. Who's got the last question? A good one. Over here.
Hi. Is it possible we did something wrong? We all go back to days of like rotary telephones, and as I've described, like we've gone through not a communications evolution, but a communications revolution. Now the salutation is not how are you, but where are you? Maybe we didn't handle Twitter and social media, and the world has gotten smaller. Did we do something wrong that we're in this situation that we're in now, this fake news and communications and what's the free content and why newspapers are in the situation they are in now?
There are several things embedded in that. I think as a business matter, we got into a situation, an economic situation, which is clearly a result of technological disruption. There's no question about it. But, technology changes, you have to deal with it. We're in the throes of dealing with it. So I think that part is correct. I don't think social media played any role whatsoever in preventing mainstream media from understanding what was going on in this country. All it took was old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. We didn't go to Michigan and Wisconsin. She didn't go and we didn't go. And that has nothing to do with technology. We could have done it the way we did it many years ago. So I blame it on an attitude, not a technology, what happened and why we didn't see him coming. And more important, why he was connecting with people. That's what matters to me. What was going on that made him an acceptable candidate? And we didn't understand that. And that was our job, to know and report what was going on in the country, particularly around an election. We were just derelict. Just got it wrong. And I'm saying, my argument tonight is, there are a lot of reasons for it, but one of the reasons was our attitude about what is a story and who should be reported on is too elitist for what's going on in the country.